Welcome to No Name, the channel where the woods hold secrets and every trail has a story that chills the soul. Here, we share real encounters from campers, hikers, and locals. Tales of strange noises, shadowy figures, and moments in the forest that you won't forget. If you've ever felt the thrill of the wilderness or wondered what lurks just beyond the firelight, you're in the right place. After listening to this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We want to hear your thoughts, your own experiences, and the moments that kept you awake at night. The forest is alive, and every story we tell brings us closer to understanding its mysteries. Something large was moving in circles around our campsite, and I could feel it before I heard it. The night air at Spruce Knob was cold, crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen pine needles, and yet there was a vibration in the air, subtle but insistent, that made my skin prickle. My name is Lucas. I was 28 at the time, and I had been camping in the Appalachian Highlands for years, but nothing had prepared me for the unease that settled over the summit that night. We had chosen a secluded clearing, tucked beneath the towering spruce that gave the knob its name, the kind of spot where you can feel the solitude of the mountains wrap around you like a second skin. My friend and I, both city-born but hardened by months of hiking and backpacking, had pitched our tents just as the sun slipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and orange. At first, the only sounds were the soft rustling of the trees, the occasional call of a distant owl, and our own movements as we prepared dinner over a small, controlled fire. We met a local named Ray earlier that afternoon, a wiry man in his 60s who had spent most of his life in these hills. He told us the usual warnings. Weather changes quickly, wildlife can be unpredictable, but there was a pause in his words, a shift in his gaze when he mentioned the northern ridge. "Something's out there," he said softly, not meeting our eyes. "Moves in circles, mostly at night. Folks don't talk much about it, but it's been around longer than I have." I had smiled at first, thinking it a harmless story to spook visitors, but now, as darkness swallowed the last traces of sunlight, his warning felt like a pulse in the air. The wind shifted, bringing with it a low, almost imperceptible sound, a scraping or dragging that made me freeze. I remember gripping my backpack straps, feeling the weight of every gear strap and knife I carried, realizing I was holding onto something more for comfort than utility. At first, I told myself it was a deer or maybe a bear poking around the periphery. But then came the rhythm, slow, deliberate, almost circular, moving around us in a way that no deer or bear would. The sounds circled our clearing as if testing the boundaries, moving closer, retreating, always just out of sight. My friend, Jonah, whispered that we should leave the fire and tents and hike down, but the idea of leaving in darkness felt like stepping into another predator's hands. We tried to make noise, banging pots together, calling out, our voices cracking under tension, but nothing changed. The movement continued, patient, observant, almost intelligent. I felt a shift inside me then, not just fear, but a deep, gnawing awareness that something large and purposeful was studying us. Our previous experience with wildlife had not prepared us for this. This was not curiosity or hunger. This was something else. I remember sitting in my tent, flashlight in hand, listening to the brush crack and the soft thud of something heavy moving over roots and fallen branches. I could hear its breathing in a way, the air displaced around it, the cadence of its motion like waves rolling in from some distant, unseen shore. Sleep was impossible. I tried to calm myself, repeated Ray's words in my mind, tried to rationalize, it's just a deer, it's a bear, it's the wind knocking the trees. But with every sound, every shift in the shadows outside the tent, my heart leapt, my mind refusing to accept any easy answer. The fire had died down hours ago, leaving us with nothing but the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the spruce needles. I remember thinking about the stories you hear from the locals, the quiet warnings about things that move when no one is looking, the subtle signs that everyone ignores until it's too late. And I realized, with cold clarity, that I was experiencing one of those stories firsthand. Hours passed, though time felt meaningless in the forest's grip. The movement never stopped. It circled, it paused, it resumed, each step deliberate. I tried to peer through the thin nylon of the tent, catching glimpses of shapes that didn't belong, shadows stretching and bending unnaturally in the moonlight. Jonah was silent beside me, breathing shallowly, staring into the same darkness, eyes wide, hands trembling. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, but beneath that there was something fouler, heavier, a musk that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I realized that what we were hearing and smelling wasn't just wildlife. It was something older, something that had moved through these woods long before the trails were cut, long before anyone had built a cabin. The thought made the hairs on my arms rise, the cold sweat forming at the base of my neck. I decided to stay awake, trying to maintain some semblance of vigilance, knowing that sleep meant vulnerability. I whispered to Jonah, keeping my voice low, "We watch. We wait. We stay quiet. Don't move unless it comes closer." And it came closer. The thudding in the brush, the scraping over logs and rocks, the sound of heavy limbs pressing down the undergrowth. Closer, ever closer. At one point, I caught a glimpse of something enormous through the gap in the tent flap, a silhouette that should not have been possible in its size and shape, moving just along the edge of the clearing, yet vanishing as soon as I blinked. My stomach turned. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the fear intertwining with a strange awe, a recognition that we were witnessing something primal, something that had survived by remaining unseen. I tried to remember every precaution Ray had mentioned, every safety measure drilled into us over months of backcountry hiking. Make noise, stay together, keep a fire, avoid areas of dense cover. But all of those instructions felt fragile now. I realized that whatever circled us was indifferent to human rules, impervious to our rituals of protection. The night stretched endlessly. Shadows bent in impossible ways, shapes appeared and disappeared, the forest alive in ways I had never before sensed. Jonah and I spoke little, conserving energy, speaking only to confirm our own survival to each other. My mind oscillated between rational explanation and the undeniable terror of the experience, knowing we were safe for the moment, yet unsure if safety would last until dawn. By the time the first faint blush of sunrise began to illuminate the horizon, the circling movement had stopped. Exhaustion weighed on us, each muscle heavy, our minds still thrumming with the remnants of panic. We emerged from our tents cautiously, scanning the perimeter. There were no tracks, no disturbances in the dirt or fallen leaves. Only the lingering signs of presence, the broken twig here, a flattened patch of moss there, subtle hints that we had been watched. The silence was absolute, oppressive, the forest holding its breath as if daring us to speak. We packed quickly, eager to leave but cautious, retracing our steps down the trail with an awareness that every snap of a twig might mark another unseen observer. On the drive back, I replayed the night endlessly in my mind. I thought about Ray and his quiet warnings, about the locals who speak of things that move unseen in the highlands, about the fragile line between curiosity and terror in the wilderness. I realized that fear in the forest isn't just about animals or storms. It's about understanding that nature contains layers we may never fully grasp, that our presence can stir things beyond comprehension, and that survival is often about patience, observation, and respect for the unseen. I also understood the subtle lesson of that night. Some encounters are not meant to be conquered or explained, only endured and remembered. And though my body was exhausted, my mind haunted. I carried with me a heightened sense of awareness, a reminder that the woods are alive in ways that transcend the ordinary, and that sometimes what moves in circles around you is not hunting, not playful, not human, but it is very, very real. I had always thought the mountains were silent, that their whispers were just the wind in the pines. But that December night in the Great Smoky Mountains taught me that some silences are deliberate, and some whispers are warnings you ignore at your own peril. My name is Carter. I was 28 then, and I grew up not far from these woods, enough to know their trails, enough to respect them, or at least I thought I did. I had come with two friends, locals like me, seasoned hikers who swore the forest held nothing we hadn't seen before. We chose a remote stretch along the Appalachian Trail near Clingman's Dome, a spot few ventured to in winter because the cold drove most campers away, and the dense fog that settles in those hollows could swallow a person whole. We set up our tents at dusk beneath a stand of skeletal trees stripped by early frost, their limbs like the arms of something patient and waiting. The sky had been bruised purple, fading slowly to black, and the mist had started creeping in long before we even finished our first fire. At first, it was just a haze, the sort that rolls down the mountains and lingers in the hollows. It smelled faintly of wet earth and decay, like the forest itself had exhaled. But as the night deepened, it thickened. We joked about it, saying it looked like something out of a horror movie, but the laughter was brittle. When the fog brushed our faces, it felt almost alive, insistent, cold in a way that the fire couldn't touch. Shadows twisted within it, the trees bending as if bowing to some unseen presence, and the trails we had hiked so confidently earlier seemed suddenly alien, carved by an unseen hand. My friend Jake swore he saw movement just at the edge of the mist, something crouched or slinking, disappearing every time we turned our heads. I didn't see it, but I felt it. An awareness pressing on my chest, making every heartbeat loud, every step hesitant. We tried to settle in, but sleep refused us. Every crackle of the fire seemed amplified, and the mist never left, lingering just beyond the circle of light. When I stepped outside to check the perimeter, I realized that the fog had encased our camp like a cage. My flashlight pierced through the veil only in short, jittering beams, revealing nothing but the same unbroken whiteness, as if the world beyond our tents had ceased to exist. The sounds of the forest were muffled, unnatural, an absence that was more threatening than any noise. My friends' voices sounded distant, hollow, as though they were speaking through water. And then came the scent, sharper now, tangy, like ozone after a storm, but sweetened with something faintly metallic. We all noticed it at the same time, our eyes meeting in the firelight, an unspoken understanding passing between us. Whatever was out there, it had decided we were part of its night. By midnight, the mist had thickened to the point where our own hands disappeared when held out in front of us. I decided to take a walk along the ridge, partly out of curiosity, partly because the anxiety pressing down on my chest refused to let me stay still. The trail had vanished under the white haze, and the wind carried sounds I couldn't identify, branches snapping under invisible feet, whispers curling around the trees, and then, unmistakably, laughter. And not the kind of laughter that comes from warmth or joy, but something thin and cold, like glass breaking. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately, leaving only the echo of my fear behind. The fog shifted then, moving against the wind, and I felt, rather than saw, a presence brushing past me, close enough to catch the scent of sweat and pine resin. My rational mind screamed that it was the wind, that it was animals, anything but what my gut was telling me. We were being watched, studied, and tested. Returning to camp, I found my friends pale, faces tight with worry. They whispered of shapes moving just beyond their tents, of shadows that seemed to pulse with intent. We tried to laugh, to shake it off, but the laughter fell flat. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, like the tap of a branch against wood, then deliberate, almost rhythmic. It came from every direction at once, reverberating through the fog, through the trees, through us. No one spoke, no one moved. We huddled together, hearts thundering, and I could feel a coldness creeping into my bones, a sickness that wasn't from the cold, but from dread itself. Minutes or hours passed, I couldn't tell. Time in the fog had its own rules. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The forest went dead. Even the mist seemed to hold its breath. At dawn, the world was unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. The fog thinned, revealing the trail, the ridges, the forest as I knew it. But in a strange, distorted light, as though the woods had shifted overnight and we were intruders in a place that now belonged to something else. We packed in silence, a weight settling over us that no conversation could lift. On the hike down, Jake whispered that he had seen footprints in the mist, tracks that didn't belong to any animal we knew. They were long, slender, human-like, but impossibly large, and they vanished as abruptly as they began. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Every turn of the trail reminded me of the shapes we had glimpsed, the scent, the laughter, and the cold insistence of the fog. It was like the forest had shown us its true face, and in doing so had carved a warning into our memories. By the time we reached the road, the sun was high and the fog was gone, leaving behind only dew-soaked earth and a sky that was deceptively calm. We didn't speak of what had happened for weeks, and when we did, our words were measured, reluctant, each detail hard-won from memory. I never returned to that section of the Smokies alone, and I carry with me a fear that isn't rational but isn't imaginary either. The forest can be patient, and sometimes it is enough to let the fog creep in, let it linger, let it remind you that in the wilderness the unknown isn't just out there, it's right beside you, watching, waiting, always ready to test the limits of your courage and sanity. Even now, months later, I dream of that fog, thick and unrelenting, sliding between trees, brushing against me, whispering secrets I cannot fully understand. And every time I pass the foothills of the Smokies, I remember that night, remember the way the mist would not disperse, and I know that some parts of the forest are not meant for casual visits, not meant for amusement, not meant for laughter. They are meant to remind you, gently at first, then insistently, that the woods are alive, that fear is natural, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave. The forest didn't release us all at once. Even after the mist cleared and the sun warmed the slopes, its presence lingered in the cracks of our minds, the spaces where reason should have resided. On the drive back toward the nearest town, we were silent, each of us watching the edges of the road, imagining that fog coiling down the valleys behind us, following. It was only when we passed the sign for Newfound Gap that I felt the first real pang of relief, a sensation so alien I had to remind myself to trust it. But something had changed in me. I could no longer look at the mountains without recalling the hush that swallowed our voices, the way the mist wrapped around us like a living thing, cold and patient, indifferent to our panic. Later that week, I returned briefly to check the area during daylight, rational curiosity driving me more than courage. The trails were quiet, almost eerily so, and the snow from an early December storm blanketed the ground. I noticed then the marks in the dirt near the old campsite, subtle depressions, elongated impressions that could have been animal tracks, but they curved and intersected in ways that no creature I knew could make. I knelt and studied them, the cold biting my fingers, and felt that same tension, the sensation of being observed. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but I sensed it. The presence we had left behind was still there, waiting, testing. I left quickly, leaving only footprints that would vanish in the next snowfall, but carrying with me the certainty that we had glimpsed something beyond ordinary perception, something that did not belong to our world but shared it with us nonetheless. The months afterward brought restless nights. I would wake suddenly, imagining the mist curling around my cabin, whispering through the trees. Friends I trusted, seasoned outdoorsmen, seemed to feel the same unease when I recounted the story. They nodded knowingly, shared their own tales of encounters that were inexplicable, warnings of the Smokies' hidden corners. The stories were not sensational. They were careful, measured, real experiences of those who had brushed against the inexplicable and survived. Each tale added layers to my own understanding, and yet it also confirmed the dread I had carried. The forest is patient, and it remembers. When I finally returned the following winter with no companions, armed only with my camera and journal, I felt the difference immediately. The silence was heavier, as if the mountains themselves had been holding their breath, aware of my approach. The familiar trails twisted strangely, bends I didn't remember, tree roots jutting up like bones through the frost. The mist appeared again, thin at first, rolling over the ridges like smoke, brushing against my face with its unnatural chill. I spoke aloud, calling my own name, trying to anchor myself, but the words felt weak, absorbed by the expanse. For hours I walked in a trance, documenting the forest, trying to rationalize what I had seen before. Yet, as night approached, the mist thickened, and I realized that solitude brought me no safety. It welcomed me, not as a guest, but as a subject under observation. By midnight, I had set up my tent again near the same hollow where we had first camped. The wind shifted, carrying sounds not of the forest, but of deliberate movement. Shuffling, whispers, faint laughter that scratched at the edge of hearing. I could feel it pressing, closer, and I realized that the fog had its own rhythm, its own consciousness. Sitting in the dim glow of my lantern, I watched it curl around the trees, brush against the edges of the tent, and I felt the truth. The mist is a guardian and a predator both. It would not harm without reason, but it demanded acknowledgement. I whispered apologies into the dark, to the mountains, to whatever lived in the fog, as if words could matter, and felt, briefly, a sense of permission to remain. When dawn broke, the mist receded slowly, as though considering my continued presence. The trail back to civilization appeared clear, the mountains reverting to their familiar shapes. But I walked with a changed awareness. The forest I knew was neither benign nor cruel. It was meticulous, watchful, and eternal. Its lessons are quiet, learned through attention, through humility, through fear that lingers long after the sun returns. I left the Smokies that day with more than photographs and journal notes. I carried the knowledge that the line between wonder and terror in the wilderness is thin, and that some phenomena, however inexplicable, are meant to test your courage, patience, and respect. Even now, on nights when the wind rises and snow rattles against the window, I imagine that creeping mist returning, rolling over the ridges, seeking, observing. It is both memory and omen, and I know that the Smokies' strange corners will always exist, whether I am near or far. The fog, persistent and deliberate, will never fully disperse. It teaches that the forest has its own stories, stories that do not always have clear endings, stories that linger in the mind like shadows at the edge of vision, haunting and beautiful, terrifying and intimate, waiting for the next traveler brave or foolish enough to enter its depths. The first time I felt the presence of something watching me in the woods, I didn't know what to make of it. My name is Daniel. I was 29 at the time, and I grew up not far from the rolling peaks of the Appalachians, so the smell of pine, wet earth, and moss is as familiar to me as the back of my own hand. But familiarity has a way of lulling you into false security, and that October night at Grayson Highlands, Virginia, taught me that the woods have their own rules and their own predators. My friend Leah, 27, and I had set out for a 2-night camping trip, aiming for solitude to escape the crowded weekend trails and the synthetic comfort of city life. We weren't beginners, but there's no amount of experience that prepares you for the kind of fear that creeps in silently, without sound or warning. We arrived just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the highlands in shades of copper and shadow. The wind carried the faint bray of wild ponies grazing along the ridge, their silhouettes moving in the distance like ghosts against the dying light. We found a small clearing near a narrow stream, enough for our 2-person tent, and unpacked quickly, eager to set our fire before the chill of night settled in. The first few hours were calm, the usual ritual of campsite routine, setting up, cooking, checking the map, lulled us into the comfort of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. At first, it was a flicker in my peripheral vision, a shadow that didn't belong, moving between the trees with impossible patience. I brushed it off, thinking it was Leah or one of the ponies. But deep down I felt it. Something else, something deliberate, lingering just beyond the circle of firelight. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply. The forest, which had seemed so inviting in the orange glow of sunset, now became an oppressive mass of black shapes and snapping twigs. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a distant branch under some unseen weight. Leah laughed nervously when I mentioned it, but I could tell she felt it too. It wasn't an animal we recognized. Even the wind didn't move like that. At some point, I noticed our food pack, which we had hung securely from a tree, was disturbed, not missing, not chewed, but shifted, the strap scratched in a way that suggested careful, deliberate manipulation. That's when the weight of the situation sank in. We weren't dealing with a deer or a raccoon. Whatever was out there was observing, testing us, learning the perimeter of our small, defenseless camp. The night stretched on, and sleep became impossible. Every crack, every distant whistle of the wind through the branches felt like a signal, a warning, a countdown. I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was another camper, another pair of eyes in the dark, moving silently in the backcountry. But the silence told a different story. Silence can be heavier than sound when you're alone in the woods. Around 2 a.m., I finally saw it, or at least something resembling a silhouette, tall, unnervingly still, framed between the trees at the far edge of our clearing. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I froze, unsure whether to wake Leah or stay quiet and watch. The figure didn't move, yet its presence seemed to fill the forest. It was neither entirely human nor entirely beast, and though I wanted to rationalize it as a trick of shadow and firelight, the hair along my neck bristled in ways I couldn't ignore. We were being hunted, though nothing made a sound. Morning brought no relief, only clarity. The underbrush near our tent was trampled in a pattern too deliberate for a deer, and the faint impression of large, heavy feet, or claws, etched the soil in a careful, measured way. We broke camp quickly, moving with more haste than we usually allow ourselves. The trail down to the lower ridges seemed longer than it should have, every rustle of leaves making me spin toward it, expecting to find that same towering figure following silently. By noon, we reached a ranger station, breathless and shaken. The ranger listened patiently, not dismissing us outright, but he offered only the kind of explanation that leaves more questions than answers. This area's remote. People report seeing figures, hearing things. Could be a bear. Could be something else. Hard to say. His words did little to calm the gnawing fear settled in my chest. I replayed the events of that night over and over. The strangest part is not the fear itself, but the way it lingers, shaping how you move through the world afterward. There was no growl, no scream, no chase, yet the psychological weight of being observed without understanding by something unknown, something intelligent enough to study us, was more terrifying than any predator I've encountered in daylight. Leah and I both swore off camping alone in highland areas after that trip. We stick to well-trafficked trails, keep our packs sealed, our fires small. But sometimes, even in the safety of the city, I feel a glance from the corner of my vision, a shadow moving just beyond the range of comprehension, and I remember the silent hunter of Grayson Highlands, a presence that tested our courage, our instincts, and left us haunted in ways no tangible wound could. The memory of that night didn't fade with distance or time. It only grew sharper in the quiet moments when the world feels too orderly, too predictable. After the ranger station, Leah and I drove down the winding mountain roads in silence, each of us lost in thought. The way the trees seemed to lean almost imperceptibly as if trying to block our view of the trail behind us haunted me more than the figure itself. It wasn't a beast of teeth and claws. It was something patient, calculating, aware. I kept imagining its eyes, dark and unblinking, tracing our movements even after we left the clearing. By the time we reached the first small town at the base of the highlands, I could barely speak. Even a conversation about mundane things, gasoline, food, directions, felt impossibly distant, as if the woods were still pressing against me from beyond the edges of the car windows. That night in the motel, sleep was a cruel impossibility. Every creak of the building, every sigh of wind through the cracked window panes felt like the same silent footsteps I had heard among the pines. I kept the lights on, flashlight at the ready, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Leah was quieter than usual, staring at the ceiling, her hands twisted in her lap. We didn't discuss the figure in detail because words seemed too weak to contain the terror we both carried. It was a shared understanding, heavy and unspoken. We had been followed, observed, and there was no reasonable explanation for what we had experienced. The most unnerving part was that there was no confrontation, no roar, no charge, just a measured presence that lingered, a predator that respected silence as much as it feared nothing. Over the next few weeks, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, unusually tall and bipedal in stance, or a hunter playing tricks from a distance. But the patterns didn't match. Bears stumble, hunters make noise. Nothing stammered, nothing betrayed itself except through its calculated observation. I went back to the photographs we took, the ones Leah had insisted on snapping at the stream, hoping some evidence had been caught in the frame. Most were blurry, shadows and branches blending into each other, but one image, a faint silhouette behind a cluster of hemlocks, made my stomach twist. Not clearly human, not clearly animal, just a shape that moved with deliberate purpose. Looking at it made my hands shake, but it also confirmed what my gut had been telling me. Whatever had been there wasn't a figment of fear. It was real, tangible, and it had studied us. Months later, when I finally returned to the highlands, but not to that same clearing, not alone, I understood the emotional dilemma that trip had left me with. Fear had a staying power, a way of anchoring you to a moment in a place where the natural world becomes foreign and hostile. Hiking again, even with a group, I found myself checking the underbrush more than necessary, listening to every snapping twig, feeling the weight of the unseen eyes. It's a subtle kind of terror, one that transforms awareness into paranoia, and yet teaches you a lesson in vigilance. The lesson isn't about courage, at least not in the heroic sense. It's about respect. The mountains, the highlands, the woods, they do not tolerate arrogance, and they will teach it to you in ways you can't prepare for. We never reported the sighting officially, mostly because there was nothing concrete to report, and the idea of being dismissed or laughed at was nearly as frightening as what we had seen. But the experience changed me. Even years later, when I tell the story, I feel that presence in the back of my mind, the silent hunter, watching, measuring, lingering, just out of reach. It's not a tale of monsters in the conventional sense, with fangs and eyes that glow. It's the terror of recognition, of understanding that you are not the dominant force in the wilderness. There is something else out there, something patient and calculating, and it leaves you acutely aware of your own fragility. Returning to the scene only amplified the haunting effect. The ponies grazed peacefully, the wind whispered through the pines, yet I felt the same weight, as if the woods remembered us, as if the memory of our presence was enough to draw the attention of whatever lingered there. The experience became a lesson in humility, in awareness, and in understanding the line between natural beauty and primal threat. Hiking through familiar trails no longer felt like freedom. It became a negotiation with forces unseen, a careful balancing act where every movement, every sound mattered. Fear, I learned, is not always about immediate danger. It can be about understanding the silent rules of a place that refuses to bend to human expectation. Leah and I eventually shared the story with a small circle of trusted hikers, people who understood the quiet dangers of Appalachian backcountry. The reactions ranged from disbelief to knowing nods. Some had felt it themselves, the subtle observation of something intelligent and patient, just beyond the firelight, just outside the circle of understanding. And yet, the story isn't meant to convince. It's meant to preserve the memory, the authenticity of that encounter. We didn't embellish. We didn't chase the creature with flashlights or cameras. We simply survived, and in doing so, we became intimately aware of the fragile thread that separates safety from peril in the wilderness. Even now, on quiet nights when the wind shifts and the trees creak outside my window, I feel a subtle echo of that presence. It's a reminder that the woods remember, that they observe, and that some predators don't need teeth to haunt your life. They only need patience, stillness, and the knowledge that humans, for all our cleverness, are transient intruders in a world that has existed far longer than we have and will outlast us. And perhaps that is the most profound terror of all, not the roar or the attack, but the awareness that something can watch, wait, and leave no trace beyond the memory it imprints on your mind. The first time I set foot on the switchbacks leading up to Klingman's Dome, I didn't realize fear could arrive so quietly, the way fog slips over the ridge before sunrise, covering everything in a soft, almost innocent gray. My name is Ethan. I was 24 at the time, and I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. Hiking and camping had been part of my life for as long as I could remember, but that March evening, the mountains felt different, older, patient, like they had been waiting to watch someone stumble into a mistake. I had driven up with two friends, Jared and Lisa, both locals who knew the trails well enough to claim we'd be fine, but there's a difference between knowing the trail and knowing the woods when the light dies too early and the shadows begin to bend around you. We set up camp at a small clearing just off the trail, a place where the trees grew thinner and the wind carried voices that weren't ours. Our tent was flanked by bracken ferns and the skeleton of a fallen oak, a quiet reminder that life and death mingle freely in these mountains. As we unpacked, I noticed the sun lingering on the horizon longer than I expected, the sky bleeding into shades of deep purple and bruised orange. The forest was alive with the creak of branches and the distant echo of a woodpecker, but beneath the ordinary, I sensed something deliberate in the stillness. Lisa laughed, unpacking her stove, and Jared tossed a bag of firewood into the circle we'd cleared. Their movements were casual, familiar, grounding, but I kept glancing up the switchback trail, the path that had brought us here, and a knot of unease coiled tighter in my chest. Night came faster than I anticipated. We ate a cold dinner under a sky that was no longer bruised but fully black, punctured with stars so bright they almost hurt to look at. I was the last to brush my teeth and crawl into the tent, the air turning sharp with frost creeping down the ridge. That's when I first saw it, though I didn't know it at the time. At first, it was just a glimmer, a pale light reflected off the curve of a branch, maybe even a trick of my tired eyes. But then it moved. Slow, deliberate, staying just beyond the trees. I nudged Lisa awake and whispered, "Do you see that?" She squinted into the darkness and shook her head, saying it was probably a hiker with a flashlight, a late wanderer finding their way down the trail. I wanted to believe her. I tried to dismiss it, but every time I closed my eyes, the memory of that motion, smooth, unnatural, pressed against the back of my mind. By the time the fire dwindled to embers, I was outside again, circling the perimeter of our little clearing. That's when I caught a glimpse of the glowing figure on the switchback, unmistakable now, though still distant. It didn't shine like a lantern. It glowed from within, a pale, bluish hue that illuminated nothing but itself. Jared laughed when I pointed it out, joking about the local myths, but even as he spoke, I felt my pulse jump at the shape's slow, deliberate climb. It wasn't moving like a person. There was no sway, no shift of weight, just a fluid, steady rise along the trail. My instincts screamed to retreat into the tent, but something held me in place. The same fascination and terror that makes people stare at accidents on the road. We argued quietly about what to do. Lisa wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I insisted it could be another hiker, just out for a late-night stroll. The rational part of me wrestled with the primal fear that was gnawing at my gut. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and the figure never faltered, never paused, never blinked. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent I couldn't name, sharp, metallic, cold, and for a fleeting moment I could have sworn I heard whispers in the trees, soft syllables I couldn't understand, like the forest was speaking in a tongue meant to warn or mock. My hands shook as I lifted a flashlight, shining it toward the trail, but the light caught nothing. The glow remained, unmoved, patient. Then the unthinkable happened. The figure stepped off the switchback into the slope that led toward us, moving faster now, but without sound. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that something this bright and ethereal couldn't just descend like that. Yet there it was, closing the distance between us and the edge of the woods. Lisa grabbed my arm, her voice breaking. "Ethan, it's coming toward us." And in that instant, the line between imagination and reality dissolved. I felt the brush of air as it passed through the clearing, the temperature dropping in a way that made my lungs ache. We couldn't see features, but we felt a presence, a weight pressing on the skin, an acknowledgement that whatever we were seeing was aware we existed. We fled toward the car, abandoning the tent, our fire, everything that anchored us to safety. Branches clawed at our jackets and scraped our arms, but we didn't stop until the switchbacks had been left far behind. When we reached the road, panting and frozen, we looked back. Nothing remained in the clearing. No light, no shadow, nothing but the moon reflecting cold off the trees. And yet, as we drove down the winding roads back to Gatlinburg, the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't a story to laugh about later. It wasn't a ghost tale to share around a fire. It was the forest itself, old and patient, reminding us that the mountains have memory, that the woods themselves can judge, and that trespassers, even the careful ones, are never truly alone. We didn't sleep that night, though the exhaustion of running on adrenaline eventually pulled us into a restless half-sleep in Jared's car, the heater struggling to keep frost from settling on the windows. Every creak of the vehicle, every gust of wind against the frame felt amplified, as if the glow had followed us, waiting just beyond the glass. I kept my flashlight within arm's reach, fingers brushing its cool metal as though it could offer more than illumination, though I knew it couldn't. By morning, the sun rose as if nothing had happened, spilling pale light over the mountains, and yet the switchback still haunted me. It wasn't just the memory of the figure, it was the echo of the fear, the knowledge that the forest could hold something completely beyond explanation and move silently while we scrambled to survive. Weeks later, we returned, not out of bravery, but necessity. We had to reclaim our gear, our tent, the things we'd abandoned in terror. I told myself the figure would be gone, just a trick of moonlight and fatigue, maybe a deer caught in the wrong angle, maybe a hiker with reflective gear. But as we ascended the familiar switchbacks, the air thick with early spring chill, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were aware we were back. Each step on the frosted soil felt heavier, like the trail itself remembered our panic. The clearing was untouched, the tent still in its neat pile, the fire pit cold and abandoned, and yet the absence of the figure felt deliberate. It was a silence that demanded respect, a void that weighed far more than anything physical. Jared and Lisa were cautious, scanning the trees, their eyes darting between trunks and shadows. Every snap of a twig made our hearts jump. Every distant bird call sounded like a warning. I noticed the way light shifted unnaturally in the thickets, how shadows pooled in corners where no tree could possibly block the sun. I wanted to laugh, to call it paranoia, but the way the forest pressed in around us, the scent of wet leaves, the damp soil, the cold that penetrated every layer of clothing, made me feel small in a way I hadn't felt before. I realized then that fear in the woods isn't about monsters or apparitions. It's about understanding the scale of the wilderness, about knowing the mountains can outlast and outwit us, and that the things we think we see are sometimes reminders of that truth. We retrieved our gear quickly, moving as one unit, every sense stretched to the maximum. And then it happened again. The glimmer, faint this time near the top of the switchback, not bright enough to illuminate, but enough to make us freeze in place, hearts hammering, breaths shallow. We didn't move, and the glow lingered for a moment before disappearing into the denser trees above. I felt my stomach twist, the same pit of recognition I had felt weeks ago, the same awareness that something had observed us, had noted our return, and was granting us permission to leave. No one spoke, and we didn't need to. There was an understanding, an unspoken agreement between us and the forest that we were intruders allowed temporary reprieve, but only if we respected the boundaries we barely comprehended. Driving down the mountain afterward, the memory of the glow stayed with me, not as a story to thrill friends or as a legend to embellish, but as a warning etched into my psyche. I realized that real fear doesn't come from shadows that can be described or explained. It comes from awareness of your own vulnerability, from knowing the environment has rules you can't negotiate, from understanding that sometimes you are not the most capable creature in the woods. Over the following months, I returned to hiking and camping, but never alone, never without preparation, never without acknowledging the weight of the Appalachian forests. I learned to carry more than food and water. I carried patience, respect, and the quiet humility that comes from knowing the mountains remember, and that sometimes the things that watch you leave a mark not on your skin, but on your sense of certainty. Even now, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can close my eyes and see the glow ascending that switchback, patient, deliberate, aware. It's not a figure meant to terrify for amusement. It's a presence meant to teach, to warn, to remind those who wander that the woods hold life and power far older than we are, and that sometimes the only safe action is reverence. And though I've told the story many times, each recounting brings back that visceral fear, that slow pulse of recognition that the forest saw us, that it still watches, and that some lessons are learned not through words or warnings, but through the silent, haunting certainty of what cannot be explained. I had never felt entirely at ease in the wilderness, even after years of weekend hikes and backpacking trips. The mountains have a way of humbling you, of reminding you that no matter how confident you think you are, the woods always have the last word. My name is Jacob. I was 28 at the time, and I had been living in Asheville, North Carolina for just over 3 years. The summer of 2019 was particularly dry, with heat lingering late into the evenings, leaving the forest heavy with the scent of pine, earth, and the faint metallic tang of the Linville River running far below the cliffs. I had been camping alone that weekend, a decision I usually avoided, but the weight of life, work deadlines, the recent ending of a relationship, made me crave solitude. My site was tucked along one of the less traveled trails overlooking the gorge, a spot I had found during a prior hike. Flat ground, a small rise for a windbreak, and a view that made the world below look small and distant. The forest was quiet in the way that feels almost sacred at first, with birds chirping, leaves whispering in the light breeze, and insects buzzing in patterns that felt like their own secret language. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent, stacked firewood, and sat close to the small flame I managed to coax from my lighter and some dry twigs. I had a journal with me and wrote about everything I could think of: the climb, the sights, the anxiety in my chest that seemed to lessen slightly as the sun dipped and the shadows grew long. By midnight, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and I had slipped into a light doze, lulled by the sound of wind through the branches. That's when it began. A sudden, sharp thud near my tent woke me so violently I nearly jumped straight into the embers. My heart pounded in the hollow quiet of the forest. The sound repeated, a deliberate, almost rhythmic series of small thunks, as if someone or something was throwing stones. Each impact was precise, striking the roots of trees, the edge of my tent, and the rocks I had scattered around my campsite. I froze. My first instinct was to dismiss it, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the pace and weight of the throws didn't match any animal I had ever known. I tried to reason with myself as the fear slowly crept in. I whispered aloud, "It's probably a rock slide or wind, that's all." But the wind was still. The trees didn't sway, and the thuds continued, closer this time, almost circling my tent. I shined my flashlight into the dark, sweeping the trees, the rocky outcroppings, even the distant ridges, but there was nothing. No movement, no figures, nothing but the black emptiness that swallowed the forest whole. Each flash of light only seemed to provoke it further. The rocks struck harder, closer. I felt a cold sweat break across my forehead. My rational mind screamed to pack up and leave, but the forest around me seemed to contract, to isolate me from the path back, as if every step toward safety was being watched, measured, and perhaps mocked. I reached for my knife, small but sturdy, keeping my flashlight in the other hand. The thuds became intermittent, almost taunting, and I began speaking to it, or them, softly. "I'm just camping. I don't want trouble. Leave me alone." The words sounded absurd, whispering into the night like I was bargaining with shadows. I listened to the soft scrape of the rocks, the subtle crunch of leaves beneath feet, or maybe paws, though I never saw any trace. Hours passed like this, time bleeding slowly until exhaustion and terror melded into a heavy haze. At one point, I thought I glimpsed a shadow moving at the edge of my vision, tall and thin between two trees, but each time I turned the light toward it, the space was empty. By dawn, the forest had returned to its deceptive serenity. No rocks lay near my tent. The ground was undisturbed, as if the night's events had been a dream. My exhaustion was deep, a gnawing physical ache, paired with the mental strain of being unable to explain what happened. I packed slowly, every rustle making me flinch, scanning the cliffs and underbrush as if the perpetrator would appear again. I left the campsite with an unsteady gait, my backpack feeling twice its weight, and my mind replaying every thud, every shadow, every impossibly precise throw. I told a few friends afterward, and they laughed it off. Bears don't throw rocks, people don't usually wander deep trails at night, but I knew what I had experienced. Something had been there. Something deliberate. Weeks later, I returned with another friend, a local hiker named Sam, to check the area during daylight. We scoured the trails, inspected the trees, and looked for signs of wildlife or other hikers. Nothing. The place felt unchanged, silent, and empty, but I could still sense that the night left a residue, an invisible layer of unease on the land. I learned to respect the forest in a new way after that trip. Alone is not always solitude. Night is not always silent. Some nights the woods have voices, and not all of them speak in ways we can understand. I still hike, still camp, still crave the mountains. But the memory of those stone-thrown warnings follows me, a quiet pulse under the rhythm of my steps, reminding me that the Linville Gorge, like many wild places, keeps secrets that are best approached with caution, humility, and a measure of fear. The first night in the woods always hits differently when you're not alone in the silence, and May of 2021 had me feeling that more than ever. My name is Caleb, I'm 32, and I've been hiking the Appalachian trails for years, enough to know the comforting rhythm of the wind through the pines, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the way a distant creek can lull you into a false sense of safety. I had planned a 4-day trek near Blood Mountain, Georgia, with the kind of quiet optimism that comes when you think you know a trail intimately. I had my gear, my pack, and my well-worn boots. But what I didn't anticipate was the man without a pack. I reached the shelter late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting the forest in an orange haze that felt almost unreal. I found my usual spot near the water pump, unpacked my stove, and began to set up for the night. That's when I saw him, walking down the trail with an odd, awkward gait and no pack. At first, I thought maybe he had just finished a shorter hike or was some lost tourist. But there was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes flicked from tree to tree, that felt off. He wore a simple gray sweatshirt and jeans that had seen better days. Nothing about him screamed, "prepared hiker," yet he kept moving as though the trail belonged to him. I tried to keep my focus on setting up, reminding myself that people wandered the trail all the time, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes with no intent at all. But then he stopped. About 30 feet from me, he paused, tilted his head like he was listening to something only he could hear. I noticed the way his hands twitched near his sides, not quite relaxed, not quite menacing, but definitely uneasy. I packed up my stove and kept my distance, slowly inching toward my tent. My instincts, honed from years in the backcountry, screamed caution, but curiosity got the better of me. I watched him trail along the edge of the shelter's clearing, pausing again as though he was studying the structure, or maybe me. Hours passed, the sky darkened, and I heard him moving again. At first, it was the faint crack of a branch underfoot, then the shuffle of leaves and the snap of small twigs. He wasn't just wandering, he was circling. I kept my head down, pretending to organize my supplies, but every now and then I would catch a glimpse of his silhouette, vanishing behind the trees, then reappearing just beyond the fire ring. My mind raced through every scenario I had ever feared. Was he lost, dangerous, or worse? The truth was, I didn't know, and not knowing made the forest feel alive in ways that were suddenly terrifying. By 10 p.m., I was lying in my tent, the mesh window open just enough to hear the night, and the man without a pack was still there. Every footstep sounded closer than it should have. I could hear him muttering softly, maybe to himself, maybe to something else. Shadows flitted between the trees, and my imagination tried to fill in the gaps. I reminded myself of the cold, hard reality of the Appalachian Trail. People get lost, people get scared, but rarely do they have any malice in mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I had been alone in these woods countless times, but never with someone who didn't seem anchored to the trail, who didn't have a map, a pack, a plan. Sleep came reluctantly, broken by the occasional rustle of the underbrush. At some point, I thought I heard him speaking my name, soft, almost inaudible, carried on the wind. My heart thudded in my chest. The flashlight I kept by my side became my only comfort, though I didn't dare use it. I stayed as still as possible, pretending to be a part of the forest floor itself. By dawn, I convinced myself he had moved on, but when I emerged from my tent, there he was again, sitting across the clearing on a log, staring at the morning fog. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't speak. He just stared, motionless, like a fixture of the forest. I approached cautiously, making my presence known, but careful not to provoke. "Hey," I said, voice steady but cautious. "You okay? You need water or food?" His head snapped toward me, eyes wide but strangely empty, and he shook his head. Not a word. He got up slowly, turning back toward the trail I had come from, but not in the way a normal hiker would. There was no stride, no purpose, just this hesitant, shuffling motion, like he was drifting from one place to another without intent. I watched him go, felt the adrenaline drain from my body, and for the first time in years, I felt vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. There was something in his presence, an unsettled human energy that made the woods feel like a trap rather than a refuge. Over the next 2 days, I encountered him intermittently, on the trail, near the water source, once just outside the shelter while I tried to eat. Each time it was the same. Silent observation, a lingering, shifting presence that made me question my own senses. I tried to rationalize it, mental illness, a runaway, someone simply lost, but the logical side of my brain couldn't dismiss the gnawing fear he inspired. At night, I found myself double-checking my tent lines, stacking rocks around the fire pit, keeping my boots within reach. The forest, which I had always considered a place of peace and solitude, had turned into a theater of paranoia. The climax came on my last night. I had decided to push a little further down the trail the next morning, ending my trip early to avoid any more encounters. That evening, I lit a small fire, trying to ignore the rustling that had started again. Suddenly, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Him, standing just outside the firelight, closer than he had ever been. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't retreat. I spoke firmly, my voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "You need to leave. Now." His lips moved, but no sound came. and then he turned, slowly, deliberately, vanishing into the darkness, leaving only the memory of his hollow stare behind. I packed at first light and hiked down the trail, every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind carrying the weight of what had happened. I never saw him again, though I told myself I had. Even now, recounting it, the memory of that man without a pack makes my skin crawl. He was a reminder of the raw unpredictability of the woods, of the fragility of feeling safe, of how close fear can lurk when you least expect it. And though I learned to carry my instincts, to respect my own intuition, I also learned that sometimes the unknown doesn't offer closure, and some encounters leave their mark simply by existing. The trail down from Blood Mountain felt heavier than it should have, as if the forest itself remembered the presence of that man without a pack. Each step I took seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves under my boots echoing through the hollows, like some invisible audience was following me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that after 3 days of constant alertness, my nerves were simply frayed. Yet, every shadow, every sudden movement of branches in the breeze kept pulling me back to that empty, piercing gaze I'd seen in the shelter clearing. I had always prided myself on being self-reliant in the woods, able to read the subtle signs of weather, wildlife, even other humans. But this was different. This wasn't about knowing the forest. It was about feeling the unnameable, the raw human unease that comes from being observed by someone who doesn't operate on the same rules. By midday, I reached a fork in the trail near a small creek where I usually refill my water, and that's when I caught sight of him again. He was sitting on a fallen tree, staring downstream, and for a moment I thought I could see the tension in his shoulders relax, as if he had been waiting for me to appear. But the second our eyes met, something tightened inside me. He didn't move toward me, didn't acknowledge me, but that weightless, drifting energy surrounded him like a fog. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to leave immediately, but my curiosity, the same trait that had guided me through countless miles of trail, kept me rooted. I stepped off the main path cautiously, keeping a visual line on him without making direct contact, trying to decipher whether he was truly lost or intentionally lingering. I spoke again, this time softer, almost pleading. "You don't belong out here alone. Let me help you." There was a brief pause. The forest was silent, holding its breath. And then, as if on cue, he rose slowly, almost ceremoniously, and walked backward toward the trees. The way he moved defied the natural gait of a hiker. There was hesitation, a stutter in his steps, like he was gliding just above the ground rather than placing his feet. I realized in that tense, frozen moment that the fear wasn't just about what he could do. It was about what he represented, the unpredictability of human presence in a place I had always thought I fully understood. I decided to push forward, doubling my pace, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. Every crack of a twig, every sudden shift in leaves made me glance over my shoulder. I had a map, a GPS, and a solid plan, but none of it mattered against the raw psychological weight of knowing someone had been near me, observing, without explanation. That night, I reached a small ridge overlooking the valley below and made camp, insisting to myself that I would sleep. I set my tent near a cluster of pines, stacked a few rocks around the perimeter, and lit a modest fire. I kept my pack within arm's reach and my knife by my side. But the woods were alive in ways that were no longer natural. Every sound exaggerated, every shadow a potential threat. Sleep, when it came, was fitful. I dreamt of the man without a pack, of his hollow eyes peering at me through the canopy, his silent presence suffocating, twisting the familiar terrain into a landscape of anxiety. I woke multiple times to the rustle of the forest, heart racing, trying to rationalize the movements of animals or the wind. But I knew the truth. Something had shifted in the forest that day, something human and unknowable. Morning arrived, reluctant and gray, and I packed with the efficiency of someone who has learned that hesitation can be dangerous. I kept glancing over my shoulder, fully expecting to see him standing there, waiting, yet the trail seemed empty. As I hiked down, the psychological weight lifted slowly, but the encounter had left a mark deeper than any physical exhaustion or sore muscle. I found myself talking to locals in the small towns near the trailhead, asking about sightings, strange behavior, anything out of the ordinary. One elderly man, sitting on a porch with a shotgun resting nearby, nodded knowingly. "You saw him, huh?" he said quietly, as if confessing a secret I wasn't yet ready to understand. He explained that hikers sometimes encountered drifters, people who wandered without purpose, unmoored from the rhythms of society or trail etiquette, and that they often left no trace beyond the memory of their presence. "They're not always dangerous," he added, "but they carry a kind of emptiness that sticks with you, makes the woods feel different." I left Georgia with that emptiness lingering, a ghost of fear stitched into my memory. The man without a pack had never made a direct threat, yet he had changed the way I experienced the wilderness. It wasn't the trails or the terrain that I feared, it was the human element, the reminder that not everything can be anticipated, and not every presence has a reason you can understand. That hike taught me to respect the unpredictability of the people who inhabit or pass through the woods as much as I respect the natural hazards. It was a lesson etched not in guides or maps, but in the raw, uncomfortable awareness of how fragile safety can feel when confronted with something truly unknown. Even now, recounting that encounter, I feel the echo of his gaze, the weightless drift of his steps between the trees. I still hike the Appalachians, still seek the solace and adventure of the mountains, but I carry with me a heightened sense of vigilance, a respect for the unpredictable. The man without a pack left no tangible trace, yet his presence remains, haunting and instructive. The forest itself seems quieter now when I recount that story, as though it knows the line between familiarity and fear, between solitude and observation, is thin. And maybe that's the real lesson. The woods are never entirely yours, and some presences will linger long after they disappear, leaving you to carry their memory, fragile and sharp, down the trail for years to come. The first time I set foot on Breakneck Ridge, I felt it like a pulse under my feet, sharp, alive, and strangely watchful. My name is Eric Thompson. I was 29 then, and I had spent most of my life chasing the quiet desperation of city life, only to realize that the forest didn't care about your regrets or your ambitions. I'd come with two friends from the city, Mark and Jill, both seasoned hikers, but equally eager for the kind of solitude you can only find in the tight, twisting arms of the Hudson Highlands. We had arrived in early September when the heat still clung stubbornly to the rocks, but the shadows stretched longer and the air hinted at an autumn chill that hadn't quite settled. We parked at the small gravel lot at the base, the kind of place that promised adventure but whispered warnings if you knew how to listen, and began our climb. The trail was narrower than we expected, roots clutching at ankles, branches scraping against jackets, and the wind, when it came, was more like a sigh than a force. By the time we reached the first overlook, the view was breathtaking. The river wound like liquid glass beneath the fading sun, the trees a riot of red and gold. But there was a subtle wrongness that I couldn't shake. The branches moved when there was no wind. At first, I thought it was Mark brushing past, or the way the morning air sometimes made leaves quiver. But the pattern was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like the forest was breathing along with us. Jill noticed it too, and laughed nervously, but even in her laughter, there was hesitation. We shrugged it off, setting up a small campsite near a copse of pines just off the main trail. Our tent was pitched under a canopy so dense that the sky felt like a distant rumor. That night, after we cooked over a small flame and shared the last of our trail mix, the forest sounded different. Branches snapped overhead, though the air was still. Shadows pooled in the hollows of the ground. I remember thinking that every rustle had intent, though I had no idea what that intent might be. Sleep came in fits. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something brushing past the tent, heavy and deliberate, like a hand against canvas. Mark had taken the first watch, whispering jokes about breakneck ghosts to keep the tension from festering. By the time the moon had climbed high, the forest was silent again, but my chest still heaved with the memory of each crack and groan. Dawn felt like relief, though even in the morning, the forest didn't entirely let go. As we began our hike further up the ridge, the branches continued their odd dance. One would fall behind us, then another ahead, though the wind never reached them. The path grew treacherous, sheer drops on either side, and I realized how unprepared we were for anything beyond casual hiking. That realization carried a weight heavier than the backpacks we slung over our shoulders. By midday, the tension became unbearable. We found a small clearing near the summit and decided to rest. Jill was the first to notice the smell, acrid like burning leaves, and something far older, like soil that had decayed for decades and had been disturbed too suddenly. We tried to dismiss it, but the forest seemed to hum, a low vibration under our feet, under the stones, threading through the roots. Then we heard it, a long, low crack, like the sound of wood splintering under immense pressure. Mark froze. I froze. Jill whispered my name, eyes wide, pointing to the trees above us. Branches were falling all around, but there was no wind. Each crash shook the ground, threw dust and needles into the air, and made our hearts pound like drums. Panic didn't come immediately, but when it did, it was sudden and total. We ran, not in a sprint, but in a desperate, stumbling flight down the ridge. Every step seemed calculated to trip us, roots and rocks conspiring to keep us in place while the forest closed in. Branches fell with terrifying precision, and each one seemed to miss us by inches, almost as if the forest was measuring our desperation. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept moving, dragging my friends with me. Jill screamed at one point, a high, terrified note that mingled with the cracking of the trees. I didn't look back, though the thought of what might be behind us never left my mind. The clearing, the scent, the snapping branches, it all became a blur, an orchestra of fear conducted by the unseen hands of the forest. By the time we reached a safer stretch of the trail, where the canopy thinned and the river glittered below without obstruction, we were shaking violently. The forest behind us was calm, almost serene, but none of us spoke. We descended the remaining distance in silence, hearts still hammering, ears straining for any sound that would suggest the nightmare wasn't over. Once at the car, Mark started it without hesitation. We didn't look back, didn't speak. The forest, the ridge, the falling branches, all remained behind us, but the memory would etch itself into our bones. On the drive back, the silence was unbearable, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Jill. Even then, I could feel the pull of that ridge, the insistence that we hadn't truly escaped, only delayed our encounter with whatever lived in those trees. The remainder of that day bled into evening like a slow, suffocating shadow. Even as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to follow us with a gaze we couldn't see. We tried to convince ourselves that the ridge had been playing tricks on our minds, that the branches had fallen due to some natural quirk of the woods, maybe an underground current of air shifting the old limbs, but every rational thought was drowned by the vivid memory of the precision with which those trees had broken around us. Back at the small motel in Cold Spring, we couldn't sleep. Every creak of the radiator, every rustle from the parking lot set our nerves on edge. Jill kept staring out the window at the darkness, whispering that she could still see shadows between the trees on the ridge, even from miles away. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I had already begun to feel the creeping doubt that maybe some part of the forest had followed us, that the ridge wasn't done with us yet. The next morning, Mark tried to joke about it again, but the laughter was hollow, brittle. We had planned to hike again, lower on the trail, to recover from our trauma, but none of us could bring ourselves to move toward the woods. Instead, we walked the quiet streets, the Hudson River to our left, and tried to find normalcy in the small cafes and tourist shops. But even in the bright morning light, the images of the ridge haunted me. the falling branches that moved with purpose, the smell of old earth burned by some unseen force, the low, almost sentient hum beneath our feet. I realized then that fear isn't just in the moment. It lingers, waits in corners of the mind, and turns memory into something tangible, something you can almost touch if you dare. It wasn't until weeks later, as I tried to process what had happened, that I understood the deeper truth of that day. Fear is often a teacher, though it doesn't announce itself kindly. The forest had shown us our vulnerability, stripped us of the arrogance that comes with confidence in our own physicality, our own skill. We had trespassed not just on land, but on a space that had rules we couldn't read, and for that it had reminded us sharply of our place. Each of us carried that lesson differently. Jill refused to hike again for months. Mark swore he would only follow certified trails under daylight with at least 3 companions. I, in contrast, felt a pullback to the ridge, not to conquer it, not to prove myself, but to understand it, to respect it, to know the difference between courage and recklessness. The memory didn't fade. Months later, when the cold had come, I would recall the sound of those branches falling with no wind and the pulse of the ridge beneath our feet. It had become a story I carried quietly, a reminder that nature's beauty is inseparable from its danger, and that the thin line between adventure and terror can snap in a heartbeat. I understood now that horror isn't always monstrous shapes or glaring eyes in the dark. It is the forest's patience, its capacity to wait until you are exactly where it wants you, then remind you that it is older, wiser, and infinitely more capable than you. Even today, I cannot return to Breakneck Neck Ridge without a sense of reverence, a tightening of the chest, a whisper of fear at the back of my mind. I tell this story not to scare, but to convey the gravity of stepping into a world that does not bend to your will. The forest is alive in ways we cannot measure. The branches fall with no wind, shadows linger longer than they should, and the quiet moments can weigh heavier than the loudest storms. Some lessons you carry not in your pack, but in your bones. And when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it, the snapping, the falling, the hum beneath the soil. I can feel the pull of that ridge, the eyes that were never truly there but were always watching. The forest, patient and eternal, reminds me that some places are not ours to tame. We are merely visitors, and sometimes the forest chooses who leaves with their life and who leaves with their sanity. Breakneck Ridge chose to leave us shaken, wary, and forever changed, and for that, I will never forget it. I never thought a camping trip in the Cherokee National Forest would feel like stepping into another world, a place where the shadows move on their own and the trees seem to watch you as you breathe. My name is Caleb, I'm 27, and I've been hiking and camping in the Appalachian Mountains since I was a teenager, always chasing the thrill of quiet woods and untamed trails. But nothing I had experienced prepared me for what happened in August 2023. I'd driven 6 hours from Knoxville, carrying only a modest backpack, a tent, and the stubborn confidence that comes from years of wandering alone. I arrived late afternoon, the sun hanging low and golden between the ridges, painting the forest floor with long, trembling shadows. The campsite I chose was small and off the beaten path, a place recommended by a local ranger who insisted it was quiet, untouched, and wild, though he had a wary tone I didn't catch at the time. Setting up the tent felt routine at first. I picked a flat patch of earth, cleared it of twigs, and hammered in the stakes. The wind had started to whisper through the trees, rustling the leaves like a distant, indecipherable language. As I stepped back and surveyed my little clearing, I noticed an odd scent, faint but unmistakable, a mix of wet earth and something musky I couldn't identify. I shrugged it off as a bear or raccoon passing nearby, something I'd encountered before, and focused on building a fire. Night fell faster than I expected, and the forest transformed from a calm green labyrinth into a dark, suffocating tangle. The fire's glow barely reached the edges of the clearing, leaving a ring of black that pressed in with silent menace. I was alone. That was part of the thrill. The solitude, the way the forest's natural sounds became an orchestra of tiny, sharp interruptions. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl kept me company, and yet the rustling beneath the trees began to feel more deliberate than natural. I told myself I was imagining it. Every shadow, every crack of a branch beneath an unseen foot could be explained away. Yet when I crawled into my tent to settle down for the night, the unsettling feeling didn't leave. I zipped it shut, felt the thin nylon walls between me and the wilderness, and tried to convince myself I was safe. But then it started, the growling. Low at first, almost a whisper under the floor of the tent, vibrating against my spine, sending my heart hammering. I froze, listening, each breath loud and harsh in my own ears. The sound grew steadily, deliberate and slow, like something large pacing beneath me. I remember thinking about bears and how they usually avoid humans unless provoked, but this didn't sound like a bear looking for food. It sounded patient, calculating, like it knew I was there and was testing me. I unzipped the tent slightly, enough to peek into the darkness, and saw nothing but the pale sliver of moonlight piercing the canopy. The growl stopped the moment I moved. I held my breath. And then it came again, closer this time, vibrating through the thin ground like a warning. I realized with a cold, sinking feeling that I wasn't just dealing with a typical animal. Whatever it was too deliberate, too intelligent to be random wildlife. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in every direction, scanning the trees and the forest floor around me. Nothing. The forest seemed empty, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. My mind raced through every horror story I'd ever heard, every cautionary tale whispered by fellow campers around a fire. I considered fleeing to the car, packing everything in the darkness, but the growl beneath the tent kept me frozen in place. It wasn't continuous, but intermittent, moving with a rhythm that mocked me. I could feel the vibrations under my sleeping pad as if the earth itself was growling at me. I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm, repeating the advice I'd given others when fear crept in during my own hikes. Stay still, assess, and wait for the chance to act. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My hands were clammy, and my flashlight's beam shook with every tremor in my fingers. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a large dog, maybe a bobcat, maybe a bear inspecting the periphery. But something about the cadence of the growls, the way it moved under the tent, told me this wasn't ordinary. I remembered the ranger's warning about that section of the forest being quiet and untouched, and laughed bitterly at myself. Quiet and untouched didn't mean safe. It meant secretive, hidden, and perhaps inhabited by creatures not easily explained. I told myself not to panic, not to make noise, but the tent walls felt like paper, and every growl felt like it could pierce them. Finally, I decided to confront it. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, letting the night air rush in, cold and heavy, carrying the scent I couldn't place. The growls ceased, as though whatever it was waiting for me to make the first move. I shined the flashlight around, sweeping it methodically across the clearing. I didn't see anything, but the ground beneath me trembled faintly, almost imperceptibly, and I realized that whatever had been there had moved away, quietly, carefully. I stayed still for a while longer, listening to the night reclaim its usual sounds, pretending, hoping, praying that the threat had passed. I could feel the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a hollow, cold exhaustion. When I finally fell asleep, it was fitful, full of fragmented dreams of growling beneath my feet, of shadows twisting into forms I couldn't recognize, always just out of reach. Morning came slowly, the sun cutting through the dense canopy, revealing the forest as ordinary and beautiful as it had seemed when I first arrived. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I packed quickly, leaving no trace behind except my racing heartbeat and a lingering sense of dread. Driving back down the winding forest roads, I realized that some fears aren't meant to be fully understood or confronted. Some are meant to be survived, remembered, and respected. The experience left me shaken, but also profoundly aware of the forest's power. In the Cherokee National Forest, in a place that seemed untouched, wild, and safe, I learned that solitude can be both a sanctuary and a trap. That night under the tent, with growls vibrating beneath my sleeping pad, I understood that fear is not just a reaction to what you see. It's a response to the unknown, the hidden, and the things that move quietly in the dark. I've returned to the forest since then, but I never camp alone in that section again. And I always respect the silence, the shadows, and the lessons of a night that felt longer than life itself. The memory of that night clung to me in the weeks after, not like a nightmare I could shake off, but as a weight pressing against the edge of my consciousness. I kept replaying it, the way the growls moved beneath the tent, the vibrations that seemed almost too purposeful to be natural. Friends asked if I'd imagined it, or if I'd just been hearing animals like any other camper. But I knew better. There was a pattern to it, an intelligence I couldn't rationalize. The forest isn't just trees and wildlife. It's a living entity that doesn't announce itself politely. That night, I had trespassed into a part of it that observes, that judges, and that leaves warnings in ways subtle yet unmistakable. I realized then that fear isn't always about what you can see. It's about the things that know you're there and choose when and how to reveal themselves. Weeks later, curiosity pulled me back into the Cherokee National Forest, though I refused to return to that same campsite. I spoke to locals in Tellico Plains, a handful of park rangers, and a few older hikers who had spent decades wandering these trails. They told me stories of strange noises in the night, of campers who reported breathing shadows and growls that didn't match any known animal. Some said it was the forest protecting itself. Others whispered of old legends about creatures that lived beneath the earth, emerging only to test intruders. I never believed in legends before, not really, but now I understood that the forest had its own logic, one I couldn't fully grasp. Every story I heard only reinforced that the forest wasn't merely a collection of trees. It was a presence, alive in ways that were difficult to quantify. On my next hike, I made careful preparations. I carried a heavier flashlight, extra food, and even pepper spray, though I doubted it would do much good against what I'd encountered. As I moved through the thick canopy, I paid attention to every sound, the subtle snap of a branch, the scuffing of leaves, the shifting of shadows. Each moment felt like a negotiation with the forest. I didn't want to provoke it, only to coexist, even briefly, within its territory. And yet, as night fell and I set up camp in a different clearing, a familiar tension returned. My heart thrummed the same way it had that August night. Somewhere in the underbrush, a low, deliberate growl echoed. This time, I stayed calm, observing, letting the sound pass around me like water flowing in the river nearby. I didn't flee. I didn't confront. I simply listened, understanding that my presence alone was enough to keep the forest curious, cautious, and wary. I realized that the encounter under the tent wasn't a mistake or a moment of panic. It was a lesson. The forest tests those who enter it alone, those who assume they can control the wild by carrying equipment or following maps. There is no control. There is only respect and vigilance. Every subsequent trip I've taken into the Appalachians carries that memory with me, a quiet reminder that the wilderness has its own consciousness, its own rules, and its own guardians. And when I tell this story, I don't do it to frighten for the sake of fear. I tell it to honor that night, the growls beneath the tent floor, and the lessons I survived. Because in the Cherokee National Forest, as in any deep, wild place, what you don't see can shape you as much as what you do. Even now, months later, I feel the echo of that experience whenever I pack a tent, when I follow a trail through dense brush, or when the wind carries an unexpected sound across the trees. The fear I felt wasn't irrational. It was earned, grounded in the tangible unknown of the wilderness. It was a fear that forced awareness, focus, and respect. It was a reminder that even a seasoned camper like me can be humbled by the quiet intelligence of nature. That night didn't just haunt me. It changed how I perceive every forest, every shadow, every sound in the dark. I walk more lightly now, I listen more closely, and I never forget the growls beneath the tent floor that taught me the forest doesn't yield its secrets lightly. I never expected a weekend in the Virginia Highlands to leave me staring at a fire that wasn't there, but November had a way of catching you off guard. I'm Marcus, 32, a longtime backpacker who's always chased the quiet thrill of the Appalachian peaks, and the Mount Rogers area had always been on my list, a stretch of wilderness that feels forgotten by time, even when the highways hum just a few miles away. My plan was simple. 2 nights in the forest, a solitary tent on a ridge above Whitetop Creek, some coffee, and the solace of silence. The air was already brittle when I arrived, the first frost of the season crisping the fallen leaves beneath my boots. Even as I pitched my tent near an outcropping that gave a sweeping view of the valley, I could feel the uncanny stillness pressing in, the kind that doesn't just hush your voice but seems to settle around your thoughts. I had the fire going by late afternoon, flames clawing toward the sky as if trying to scratch a memory from the clouds themselves. Smoke spiraled in sharp ribbons over the ridgeline, and the world beyond the trees felt entirely separate, distant, almost suspended. I thought of the locals I had spoken to on the drive up, 2 old men at a gas station near Damascus, faces etched with decades of forest wind, warning me that nights in the higher elevations carry their own kind of watchfulness. "Keep your eyes open after sunset," one said, half laughing, half serious. I laughed it off, tucked the warnings away with my gear, thinking they were just the customary folklore of a mountain town. I didn't realize how literal that advice would become. Night fell with a suddenness that shook me. One moment, the sky was bruised with twilight, and the next, the forest seemed swallowed by darkness so complete it had weight. The firelight made the shadows jump and flicker, turning every stump and branch into a creature lurking just at the edge of perception. That's when I saw it, a small glow across the valley, faint but unnatural in its steadiness. At first, I thought it was another camper, maybe a hunter, a group around a fire I couldn't hear or smell. But something about it was wrong. The light hovered, not flickering like a flame should, almost pulsating like a heartbeat in the night. I strained my eyes through binoculars, the cold biting my cheeks, and saw nothing human. No figures, no movement, just that glow, far too precise to be fire, too deliberate to be a reflection. I spent hours observing it, my imagination wrestling with logic. Each time I blinked, I swore it seemed closer, as though it wasn't static across the valley, but moving with a slow, deliberate drift toward me. I tried calling out, my voice swallowed by the hollows of the mountains. Nothing. Only the cold, only the forest, and that quiet, unblinking light. Sleep became impossible. I felt my own pulse echoing through the trees, as though the woods had a rhythm I was only beginning to notice. Around midnight, I bundled myself in my sleeping bag, but even cocooned, I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched. Every snapping twig, every whispering wind sent my heart into a staccato panic. At some point, I slipped outside, needing to see it more clearly, the need gnawing at me like hunger. The valley stretched beneath the ridge like an inked canvas, the glow still there, now sharper, unmistakable against the black. I couldn't rationalize it. No campers, no hunters, no wildlife should produce a light like that. I tried to track it as I moved along the ridge, and that's when I realized something even stranger. It seemed to retreat when I approached, keeping just out of reach. I backed up instinctively, and it shifted forward again, maintaining a perfect, impossible distance. My rational mind screamed for a logical explanation, and I scoured the horizon for glints of reflective metal, any hint of human presence, but found nothing. Only the valley, deep and silent, and a fire that refused to burn in any conventional sense. By the second night, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but I couldn't abandon the ridge. Sleep felt dangerous, like closing my eyes would allow something to slip closer unseen. At one point, I sat frozen on a rock, feeling the forest breathe around me. The wind shifted, and with it, the glow vanished, leaving the valley as it had been in darkness. Relief, brief and hollow, washed over me until I noticed the faint outline of smoke curling into the sky, not from my camp, not from anything I could identify. It was subtle, almost ethereal, and yet unmistakable. My body went rigid, and my thoughts scattered. I didn't understand what I was witnessing, but every instinct screamed to leave, to descend the ridge, to abandon reason entirely. But I couldn't. Something about that glow had hooked into my awareness, like a thread I couldn't sever, tying me to the valley below. I spent hours moving back and forth along the ridge, tracing the light whenever it appeared, feeling it shift and vanish at the edges of perception. There was no pattern I could identify, only the creeping certainty that I was being drawn into something beyond the mundane. By dawn, I realized I hadn't eaten, barely drank, and my phone battery was dead. Yet still, I lingered, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. When sunlight finally began to lace the treetops, I saw the valley in its full, terrifying emptiness. Nothing remained of the glow. No trace of smoke, no footprints, no signal of any kind. The entire landscape was untouched, as if the night had swallowed it whole and spat it back into the world with no evidence of its haunting. I broke camp silently, my hands trembling as I packed the tent, my thoughts a tangle of disbelief and unease. Walking down the ridge toward the road, I replayed the nights over and over, trying to ground myself in logic. Did I hallucinate? Did fatigue conjure some spectral trick? Nothing fit the facts, the movement, the precision, the impossibility of the light's behavior. Every story I had heard of the Appalachians' haunted ridges of strange lights and mountain spirits came unbidden to mind, and I realized why locals spoke in half-joking, half-serious tones about watching the night. They knew something I hadn't yet fully grasped. Wilderness isn't just quiet. It watches, it tests, and sometimes it shows things humans aren't prepared to see. Even now, weeks later, I can close my eyes and see that glow across the valley, steady and deliberate, waiting just beyond comprehension. I tell the story cautiously to others, carefully skirting exaggeration, because the truth is frightening enough. A light that disappears when approached, that knows distance and curiosity, that seems to exist only to be seen and never understood. It forced me to confront the fragility of perception, the thin line between observation and obsession, and the profound vulnerability of being alone in the wilderness at night. The mountain taught me a lesson in vigilance, in humility, in the quiet terror of the unseen. And though I've returned to the trails many times since, Mount Rogers holds a permanence in my memory that no other peak can match. A reminder that sometimes what disappears across a valley is not just a light, but a part of your own certainty, gone forever.